Hello, readers. Benjamin Abelow received his BA in European History from Penn and an MD from Yale. During his life, he has spent time in Washington, D.C., lecturing, writing, and lobbying Congress about nuclear arms policy. And he's the author of the new book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine, understanding how U.S. and NATO policies led to crisis, war, and the risk of nuclear catastrophe. Ben, thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
I'm okay, Trey. Thank you.
So the goal of this book, as you stated in the introduction, was really to dispel the Western narrative about what is happening with the war inside Ukraine right now. Although it's not necessarily trying to give a pass to Putin for the decision that he made to invade earlier this year, you do a great job of explaining 30 years of provocations that really started with the disbanding of the Soviet Union. Many have said that NATO expanding into Eastern Europe has contributed to the tensions, but you say that that thought is actually incomplete. How so?
Yeah, well, I think it's very true. And if I had to pick a single thing, maybe I would say NATO. But the reality is that a lot of countries, and especially the US, have been arming Ukraine and doing military exercises with Ukraine, either just bilateral US Ukraine training, arming, or these big multilateral exercises where, 8, 10, 15 countries are doing these big military exercises associated with Ukraine right on Russia's border that are actually not part of NATO. So sometimes when they talk about NATO, they say, oh, NATO, that's not a problem because Ukraine's not even a member of NATO yet. And in fact, it's not likely they're going to join so quickly. But they're completely forgetting about the fact that there's all kinds of other stuff going on. And as part of that, they're actually, working toward bringing Ukraine up to NATO standards, even militarily, even though it's not in NATO. So I think I say it's the question of NATO expansion is real, but it's incomplete, and people just don't really. Number one, it's kind of an abstraction. They don't really understand what NATO expansion means in a military sense. And number two, they're kind of forgetting about the fact that, yeah, if you put a certain weapon in Ukraine through NATO versus through the US or through the UK, what's the difference? It's pointing at Russia. It's on their border. So that's where I was going with that.
Chapter 1 is Western provocations from 1990 to 2014. And there's been a lot of arguing, especially over the last 9 months or so, as to whether NATO actually promised not to expand east in 1990. Well, this was never written down as part of any formal agreement. That doesn't mean that it wasn't promised. So the question becomes, Ben, why would it have been promised back then as part of maybe some larger negotiation that it would have been attached to at the time?
Yeah. This is a time, 1990, 91, when the two Germanys, East and West Germany, were going to reunify. It was already clear that that was happening, and or that was, that people wanted that to happen. And it seemed like it was going to happen. And the question was, what would be the form of that reunification? And the Soviet Union still existed at that time. Now, the Soviet Union had about 4,000 troops in East Germany. And the West, of course, wanted the East and West Germany to reunify under NATO auspices. So you can't have, 400,000, almost 500,000 Soviet troops sitting in East Germany and have this whole thing come together as a something, essentially a Western type state under NATO auspices with these Soviet Union's troops there. So one of the ways that the US and other Western countries tried basically to mollify Moscow, to make them comfortable to remove their troops, is to give a set of assurances that after the unification of Germany, that NATO would not expand, moving into other countries to the east of Germany. In fact, it was not even going to expand east of the Elbe River, which pretty much divided East and West Germany. So there were quite a set of assurances. People oftentimes will talk about James Baker, and he did have discussions with Gorbachev. And if you can find those documents online, and one can form their own judgments about what he didn't say. But quite a few countries were involved in this. And there's documentation anyone who's interested in this can search. There's a organization called the National Security Archive of George Washington University. It's basically an academic project associated with George Washington University. And they have a whole documentary set of evidence connected with this question. And they also provide a detailed summary and assessment from the people who run that website to explain, the nature of the assurances. There's also a paper by a researcher at Boston University named Joshua Shifrinson, published in the journal International Security, where he went into the US archives and dug into what was being said to, what was being said to the Soviets and what was actually being said back in the US. And it seems quite clear that while there was no formal, written, legally binding treaties, that a variety of countries, including the US, really did offer assurances that this expansion would not happen. But it did happen. Yeah.
And that's important to understand because we're at the beginning of an attempt to regain trust between these two sides. And immediately you have, well, maybe not quite immediately, but soon thereafter, you do have an erosion of that trust when NATO does expand to 3 different countries at the end of the century. That would be Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Why was the inclusion of Poland important as it relates to Russian relations, Ben?
Yeah, well, one issue with Poland is they have a long history of kind of Russophobia, really. I mean, they're, of course, had a troubled relationship with the Soviet Union. There's basically other problems associated where there's been a great deal of animosity coming from Poland toward Russia. And in fact, that still exists. So one of the concerns, and this had been raised by a number of people at that time, is that you can't bring it's a problem enough expanding NATO, but to bring a country in that is overtly hostile to Russia, that is even a kind of a worse provocation. And the idea that you would have a hostile country, then an overtly hostile country to Russia as part of NATO and possibly influencing their policy, was something that could only have been very disturbing to Russia. I'll give you one quick example, to give you a sense of the hostility from Poland that exists even now. So this whole question of the pipeline being exploded, the bombing of the gas pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2. So there is a man there named Radek Sikorski. He's actually the husband of Anne Applebaum, who's quite a conservative American writer. And Sikorski, right after this explosions, he posted on his Twitter account a picture of the gas bubbling up through the ocean, and it basically said, "Thank you, USA." And he basically pulled it off, and that was actually quite an interesting thing because, number one, he's somebody who's a member of the European Parliament, and earlier than that, he was actually basically the Polish foreign minister, who's somebody who not only has strong anti-Russian feelings, but may actually have inside information about what happened. And then he pulled that offline. But that statement, even coming now, gives you a sense of some of the hostility and some of the tension between Poland and Russia. So
those 3 countries were added in 1999. 2 years later, in the fall of 2001, George W. Bush withdrew the U.S. from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM, which was originally signed in 1972. It was the first time in recent history that the U.S. had withdrawn from a major international arms treaty. Even though it happened after 9/11, Ben, that wasn't the given explanation as to why. So why did it happen then?
My understanding, this is one of the areas I would like to look into more deeply, but my understanding is the primary reason was that Bush wanted to move forward with kind of a Star Wars defense program. And they felt that this ABM treaty would, inhibit that and get in the way of that. Now, of course, the argument against leaving the treaty is, severalfold. One is that you really, Star Wars programs do not work. They're very easy to overwhelm. All you have to do is add more warheads or even dummy warheads, and you can overwhelm whatever defenses are in place. So the whole idea that this could actually provide a protection is kind of a fantasy. But beyond that, it's very important that ABM treaties not go forward, because even if they're not effective, to the extent that one side fears that the other side might actually be able to, let's say, launch a first strike and then, prevent the retaliatory strike from coming in, which is an essential part of kind of mutually assured destruction. This is something that really can create a lot of instability. It creates even if it can't do this in reality, it can create an image in the mind of a country that the other country thinks it can attack first without having to worry about the counterattack. And that, of course, can sort of destabilize the whole situation. The country that fears being attacked first now feels itself pushed more towards a launch on warning policy. They don't even want to wait for the missiles to arrive because they're afraid they may not be able to retaliate at that point. So these are some of the problems with withdrawal from the treaty.
In 2004, NATO expanded again, this time into Romania and Estonia, the latter of which, of course, is on the Russian border. And at a NATO summit in 2008, NATO announced its intentions of adding Georgia and Ukraine as members. This was an idea that was being pushed hard by the US. So why did it end up not happening?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that the US is one of the more aggressive and assertive members. I mean, first of all, it basically runs NATO to a large extent. If the US wants something to happen within NATO, they're the major funder within NATO in terms of military power, the greatest military power. They have the most influence in NATO. So the main reason why it didn't, I mean, this memorandum, it's sometimes referred to as the Bucharest Memorandum, as the conference took place in Romania, was that Germany and France did not want, they were concerned at what would happen if membership was offered to Georgia and to Ukraine. So they opposed this idea, but George Bush, this is George W. Bush, the second Bush, really wanted this to go forward. And what was eventually done was a compromise. There was an affirmative statement that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO, or quote unquote, will become members of NATO, but that because of the opposition, mostly of France and Germany, there was not immediate action to take them in. There was no membership action plan. There was none of the steps that would be taken to immediately bring them in. And that's really been the status ever since. And the US has refused to, and NATO has refused to renounce this quote unquote open door policy that yes, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. We're just not saying quite yet when. That's the official policy now.
And at what point did Russia wage its 5-day war with Georgia as a sort of response to this news?
Yeah, about 4 months after this open door announcement of, NATO, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. There was actually, it's sort of a complicated story, but the kind of the short version of it would be, and I can go into more details if you want, but the short version is simply that in response to this ongoing NATO expansion and the threat that Georgia, which is also right on Russia's border, separated by a kind of a range of mountains, but still on the border, the threat that Georgia would become a member of NATO ultimately played an important role in Russia, crossing the border and entering into Georgia. Now, what actually precipitated this, people oftentimes incorrectly describe this as kind of an unprovoked invasion of Georgia. And in fact, the story I just told, although it's very important, could actually leave that impression, but it's quite a different story, the reality. Georgia has two semi-autonomous regions on their northern border. One of them is sort of on the northwestern border, and one is kind of central northern border. And the central one, right up against Russia's border, is called South Ossetia. And there have been conflicts between South Ossetia and the main government in Georgia for a long time before that. And South Ossetia had an ongoing relationship with Russia. And what actually happened is that NATO, actually, forgive me, it wasn't NATO, it was the US led a multinational military exercise in Georgia with 2,000 troops in Georgia at that point. At that time also, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the Georgian president, had a very close relationship with the US and NATO and was trying to get into NATO. He was basically a pawn of the US, really. And what happened 2 weeks after this military exercises ended is that the Central Georgian government launched kind of a massive artillery and rocket assault on South Ossetia. And this went on for, I think it was 24 hours. And ultimately, the European Union funded an independent study and basically determined that this was massive artillery and rocket attacks on non-military civilian areas within South Ossetia. And what actually happened is Russia, and then they invaded South Ossetia with their land forces as well after this massive assault. And then at that point, Russia went in through there's a tunnel that goes through the mountains that connects Russia to South Ossetia. And it was only then that Russia went in. Further complicating things, South Ossetia had a peacekeeping force there, which included Russian soldiers. And some of these soldiers were actually killed during the South Ossetian attacks. So in some sense, they went in to protect their peacekeepers. Those peacekeepers were there for, I think it was 92, if I recall, under an international agreement. And when the EU evaluated the whole thing, they actually determined that it may have been justified under international law for Russia to actually enter the country in response to the killing of their peacekeepers. Now, the EU also qualified, and they said, on the other hand, this has been an ongoing long-term conflict between South Ossetia and Georgia, and we don't totally exonerate Russia, but the immediate cause was certainly this attack by Georgia on South Ossetia. So, you really have that, and you take that in the context of NATO expansion, this occurring just 4 months after this open door declaration at Bucharest. It really fits together that this was in some way a response by Russia to the expansion of NATO and to an attack on what was sort of its de facto ally right on Russia's border.
Fast forwarding now to late 2013, early 2014 in Ukraine, far-right Ukrainian ultra-nationalists pulled a coup in Ukraine late 2013, early 2014 that forced its democratically elected pro-Russia president to flee the country. Now, I know there's a conversation to be had about Russia paying billions of dollars to this guy as a way to earn his support and his siding with Russia on a lot of different international issues. But just how much support did this coup receive from the U.S., and how do we know?
Yeah, I mean, the two pieces that we know most strongly, excuse me 1 second. The two pieces we know most strongly are, number one, Victoria Nuland, who was then assistant, what was she? She was Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, basically the State Department official most immediately responsible for that area. In 2013, she was recorded. You can find the video on YouTube. I actually have the link in my book. I have the links also to the National Security Archive and to Joshua Shifrinson's article on the whole question of the assurances that were given to Russia too. But Nuland stated just boldly that the U.S. had spent over $5 billion on quote unquote democracy promotion in Ukraine, and that's basically working behind the scenes to do what you can to overturn the current government. It's ostensibly done in a very benign way, that you are just promoting democracy, you're trying to spread Western values of freedom, etc. But it often goes well beyond that, and it's impossible to know how far it goes beyond it. Oftentimes there's connections with the CIA, but even if we take it at the most basic level, that the U.S. had spent billions and billions of dollars and was actually involved in trying to coordinate the protests. Victoria Nuland herself was walking around giving away, cake and to the protesters. Now, where things really started getting interesting was in early February 2014, a phone conversation between Victoria Nuland, again, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. A secret phone call that they had was either intercepted or leaked. Most people think it was probably intercepted by Russian security, and it was basically posted. It was handed over to Wikipedia, WikiLeaks. Excuse me, I get my wikis mixed up. And it was quite an extraordinary conversation where they were basically picking who was going to be the next prime minister. And this is 3 weeks before the events happened. So you have, senior members of the US State Department discussing who should be the next prime minister and doing it in a way that really indicated that they could control the situation. So that was quite extraordinary. And then a few weeks later, one of the things that's complicated is you often hear the protests referred to as the revolution of dignity, or they refer to as a real democratic uprising. And the thing that's complicated is that there really were democratic elements. There were people, especially within Kiev, or Kiev, however you want to say it, that really were opposed to the corruption in the Yanukovych regime. He was the sitting president. That really did want the Ukraine to join the European Union and in the business relationships. And there were, real protests about that. But what actually happened was that the Ukrainian far right basically moved in and took a major role in the protests. And actually, people call them, fascists or neo-fascists or neo-Nazis, and whatever they are, whatever name is most appropriate, they certainly were far right, ultra-nationalist, and they were armed. And they took over government buildings. And the best evidence available is actually that this faction that basically subverted the more or less peaceful demonstrations actually opened fire on the peaceful demonstrators and killed close to 100 people as a false flag attack to try to arouse support for the new regime. And this was actually all, again, I linked to this in the, I don't discuss this in detail in the main body, but in the relevant footnote, I linked to it. There's a Ukrainian-Canadian researcher named Ivan Kachanovsky, who basically did the heavy lifting on this. And he's the one who determined that this really was a false flag attack, which is kind of remarkable because it was actually that killing of those protesters that led to the recognition, both by the US and by the world media, of the new regime. So it's quite an extraordinary set of events. I also want to mention that although it's very true that money was given from Russia to Ukraine as part of trying to keep their connection with them, that the majority of Ukrainians actually wanted to maintain financial relationships with Russia. There were a small number that wanted to get rid of their relationship with Russia and just establish an association with the European Union. But the majority either wanted to maintain it solely with I'm sorry, I say Soviet Union, Russia. Either the majority wanted to stay exclusively with Russia or wanted to have it with both. And there were actually terms in the European Union Association Agreement that in effect required Ukraine to basically side with NATO militarily and also to effectively renounce economic relationships with Russia. So what Russia really did was they said, they seemed to be open to actually having joint relationships with, three-way, Ukraine, Russia, and the European Union. But this seemed to be precluded by the European offer. And Russia ultimately and there were also financial reasons why it might not have been a good deal for Ukraine. But ultimately what happened is Russia gave a chunk of money to Ukraine, and they also made a deal where they would get very steep discounts on Russian gas, kind of in exchange for establishing this. So the Yanukovych regime, Ukraine has a long history of corruption, and I don't know all the details now, but I would suspect there's pretty serious corruption currently. But I cannot rule out some sort of direct corrupt connection between Russia and Yanukovych in terms of this deal. But what is known is that there were very above board financial arrangements that actually seemed very much in Ukraine's interest to maintain connections with Russia. And there were specific things about the about the European Union offering that really made it a very bad deal for Ukraine in many respects. And then on top of that, public opinion surveys, as I mentioned, actually indicated that the majority of Ukrainians wanted to maintain economic relationships with Russia. And that was actually a survey that was done by the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which, you know, if you're looking for a survey that, if anything, would be biased in the direction that the U.S. wanted, that survey itself showed that the majority of Ukrainians wanted to maintain relationships. So this, although there certainly was a very real democratic element to these protests, the story that's told that this was somehow, the takeover of the government and all this stuff was just a legitimate uprising, a popular uprising, is really not accurate. It's much more complicated than that, and seems to point to violent, extremist, effectively murderous elements within Ukraine that played a crucial role in the killings that led to the recognition of the new government.
Yeah, one add-on to your political corruption comment. Let's not act like political corruption is unique to Russia and Ukraine. Politics and corruption go hand in hand, just like peanut butter and jelly, Ben.
Yeah.
What was Russia's response to the 2014 coup?
What was Russia's response? You know, the most immediate and most important response was that they basically took over Crimea. And the major concern there seemed to have been, and it was really a valid concern, you know, although Crimea had been part of Ukraine for several decades, it was basically given to Ukraine by Khrushchev, even though for effectively 2 centuries before that it had been part of Russia. And nobody really knows clearly why Khrushchev gave this to Ukraine. I think Khrushchev was Ukrainian by birth. There's a sort of a story that basically he got drunk and gave it away in a poker game or something. But the important part I think for our story is that there's a major naval base in Crimea in the area of Sevastopol. And this is the major Black Sea naval base of Russia. And they had a long-term lease signed with Ukraine that was going to last until probably 2047, where Russia basically had use of that base. And with this it's vitally important. This is a warm water base. It means it doesn't freeze over in the winter. You can, if you have a base that's is not a warm water base, basically your base becomes inoperative or extremely difficult to operate in the wintertime. And that's, if that's a major base, you can't have that. So there was a very legitimate concern within Russia that Ukraine was at that point, which was now in possession of Crimea, was going to actually hand over the naval base to NATO. And Russia, this would kill half their navy. They just felt that they had to go in and take this base. They could not, in terms of their own military security, let this go. There were other things that were going on within the country that were deeply affecting the Russian-speaking population in a very bad way. Some of those policies were walked back over time, but there's basically been a great deal of hostility towards the Russian population. And it's complicated there. There's Russian-speaking, there's culturally Russian, they overlap, but not completely. So there's a lot of complicated elements to this. But and then of course there was this whole conflict in the Donbass, which has been going on since 2014. The story that to me is most compelling about why Russia went into Crimea really had to do with this naval base. That they felt this along with everything else, along with NATO on their borders, along with NATO pushing up, as you said, into Estonia, establishing relationships with Georgia, although they never brought Georgia in. This idea that Ukraine could literally hand over their most important Black Sea base to NATO, I think was just a killer for them. And they just said, this is it. We're going to secure this piece of land for ourselves.
And this leads us into chapter 2, Western provocations from 2014 to 2022. After Russia takes control of Crimea, the U.S. really intensifies its presence in that part of the world. That includes pumping more than $4 billion in military aid into Ukraine. And this was in the 8 years before the war started earlier this year.
Yeah.
What did the U.S. do in Romania in 2016 that further fueled tensions with Russia?
Yeah. I mean, this had actually been initiated earlier, but the U.S. established an ABM, anti-ballistic missile station in Romania. I think that they may have actually started work on that like in 2010 or 2011. I'm forgetting some of these numbers now, but this became operational in, I think it was 2016. This is an anti-ballistic missile base in Romania. It has 24 launch tubes that when used in the ABM mode, it can launch 24 anti-ballistic missiles and shoot down, incoming warheads. Now, the U.S. claimed that, oh, this is not directed against Russia. This is to prevent Europe from being attacked by nuclear missiles from Iran or North Korea, which, is kind of implausible, I think. But what was, I think, especially troubling to Russia was that this is a multi-use set of launch tubes. And those tubes, they can accommodate anti-ballistic missiles that can shoot down warheads or shoot down incoming ICBMs. But they can also, within 24 hours, be completely switched over to load nuclear warhead Tomahawk missiles with a 1,500-mile range that can hit Moscow and other targets in Russia, deep into Russia. And these warheads, they have what's called the selectable yield. You can basically dial a yield, how much kilotons do you want? And those warheads could go up to 150 kilotons, which is 10 times the Hiroshima bomb. So now you're talking about something, a NATO country that was assurances were given we're not going to come into NATO, Romania, that now you have set up an ABM base after the unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty by the US. And the particular hardware that you happen to put in there is a Mark 41 launch system made by Lockheed Martin that is a highly flexible system that can accommodate not only Tomahawk nuclear tipped cruise missiles, but other nuclear missiles. So you have this kind of confluence of events pushing right up towards Russia's border. It's quite extraordinary. And there were a number of other things that were even more striking than that. By the way, I think it's not operational yet. It could be by now, but there's actually another one of these Mark 41 ABM bases that is being built in Poland and is set to go into operation this year. The reason why I hesitate is that we're already in October now. This base is set to go into operation in 2022. I just don't know what month. And it's possible that in the midst of everything that's going on with the Ukraine war, this new ABM base with another 24 launch tubes directed at Russia, or with, let's just say with compatible with Russia-directed nuclear weapons, may actually have gone into operation in Poland already. And if it didn't, then it's set to go into operation very soon. So there's a lot that's happening.
So for those wondering if this Ukrainian flirtation and Russian instigation continued under Donald Trump, it did. In 2017, they start selling lethal weapons to Ukraine, which was a change in policy from the 3 previous years. Yeah. And in 2019, the U.S. withdrew from another treaty, this one on intermediate range nuclear weapons. Is the significance basically speaking to all the stuff that you had just talked about there?
Yeah, I mean, from a Russian, yeah. So this, let me just give a little more background. So the withdrawal of something called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. These are land-to-land or ground-to-ground missiles that are longer range than like tactical battlefield rockets that, a few 100-mile range, and much shorter than these intercontinental weapons like ICBMs. But they're significant ranges. They have ranges that range between, let's say, 500 and 5,500 kilometers. And this treaty was basically to prevent, a set of arms races where the U.S. would be placing nuclear weapons directed at Russia within Europe, and Russia might be tempted to place weapons, closer to the U.S. border. The U.S. withdrew unilaterally. There were accusations by the U.S. that Russia cheated. Russia had accusations that the U.S. cheated. And in fact, these ABMs, there was a question of whether that was actually even allowable under this, because they could accommodate these other weapons. But the important part is that the U.S. actually, in the end, unilaterally withdrew. Russia really wanted to try to negotiate again about these the question of violations and try to come to an understanding and keep the treaty in effect. And it's possible that one or both sides actually were in violation. It's possible that neither side was. These are complicated technical issues, but they required negotiation and discussion and resolution. Russia really wanted to resolve them. The U.S. just pulled out unilaterally. And in fact, even after the U.S. pulled out, Russia offered a moratorium that they said, look, okay, we're out of the treaty now. And one reason why maybe U.S. pulled out is you wanted to be able to counter, new nuclear weapons in China. So we'll stay out of the treaty. You do what you want with China. We'll do what we want with China. But let's, in terms of the weapons directed at ourselves, let's come to a moratorium and agree that neither side will deploy new weapons. And the U.S. refused that as well. So there really was a very aggressive stance. And what the evidence appears to be is that the U.S. just felt that they might be able to obtain a kind of tactical, short-term strategic. I'm using multiple terms here. Tactical. They could obtain a kind of theater range, intermediate range advantage over Russia by leaving this treaty. Now, of course, there was no attention paid to the fact that, of course, when the U.S. leaves, Russia's going to start, going wild and developing all kinds of new weapons, and maybe even putting them on barges off U.S. territory and things of this nature, which is, Russia has actually developed a whole set of new weapons in response to this. But, this was sort of another thoughtless, provocative move by the U.S. that was taken for what U.S. perceived to, I don't even want to say U.S., let's call it certain U.S. foreign policy and military elites. I don't want to suggest that this is actually in the U.S. advantage or to the U.S. benefit, that they took action that they perceived to be to the advantage of the United States in a way that was extremely provocative, and if anything would greatly increase the risk to the United States over time. Look at this war. This war is the outcome of all these steps that the U.S. and NATO took ostensibly to increase their security, but doing so in a way that was, done with almost total disregard for Russia's security and Russia's legitimate security concerns.
That's right. Another one of those examples is something you touched on briefly at the start of this conversation. That is, in 2020 and 2021, NATO flexed its military muscle by conducting live fire training exercises in Estonia, just 70 miles from Russia's border. I mean, people listening right now should think about if you had the shoe was on the other foot and something like this was happening 70 miles from the U.S. border with a group that we didn't have all that much trust in. That would be a recipe for disaster. That would be a recipe for some sort of response. Also in 2021, Ben, the U.S. and NATO diplomacy with Ukraine really intensified. In June, NATO repeated a desire to add Ukraine as a member. In August, the U.S. and Ukraine signed a strategic defense framework. And in early November, the U.S. Secretary of State and Ukraine Foreign Minister signed a similar document titled the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. What was the intent of this latter agreement?
Yeah, boy, you raised a ton of important issues in one go right there. Let me just go back to the beginning of what you said before I talk about some of these other moves. I just want to provide a little more background and let your viewers understand a little more fully what happened in Estonia in 2021.
Sure.
So just to set the stage, again, we're talking about a country, Estonia, in the Baltics, right on Russia's border, a country that is part of NATO, that was one of those many countries that assurances had been given that NATO would not expand into. So the starting point is this country that by assurances should never have been part of NATO in the first place. Now in 20 and 2021, a series of live fire rocket exercises were undertaken in Estonia, as you mentioned, 70 miles from Russia's border, using rockets that had a range of approximately 300 miles. That is a range that could enter into Russian territory. And the training exercises were specifically designed to practice destroying air defense systems inside Russia. Now, I'm not saying that the US was intending to launch any kind of preemptive attack or that NATO was intending to do that. This was done ostensibly as part of a plan. What would we do if Russia invaded Western Europe? Well, one of the things you might want to do is, try to, hit behind their lines and things of this nature. So I'm not suggesting that the US really was planning a preemptive attack, but whether they were or weren't, you got to look at how this looks for Russia. You're looking at an assault, planning an assault and practicing an assault, live fire, which means that these missiles actually took off. They just didn't have the warheads. And of course, they didn't cross over into Russian territory. But this was to fully certify the crews so they could really fire these things. And to target air defense systems, which are defensive systems inside Russia, not offensive systems, adds like another layer of threat onto the whole thing. From a Russian perspective, the thought has got to be, what the hell are they doing targeting our defensive systems from territory that never should have been part of NATO, right on our border? And as you said, just picture how the US would react if somehow Russia established a relationship with Canada or Mexico and set up military forces there and started practicing destroying targets inside the US. I mean, you would, there would be an immediate demand for removal of this stuff. And it wouldn't be, years and years of requests like Russia was doing. It would have been a demand. And if it hadn't been, that demand had not been acted on forthwith, the US probably would have launched a preemptive attack. And, they probably would have entered into World War III over this. So, as you said, putting the shoe on the other foot, and that's actually the title of one of the chapters in my book, it gives you a sense, by focusing on how the US might respond if Russia did this to the US, I think it provides a kind of psychological insight into what might be going on in the heads of people inside Russia, both ordinary citizens, but also politicians and military planners in Russia. The US would say, well, we were really just thinking about defensive maneuvers. I mean, if Russia went into Canada and did these tests and said, well, don't worry about this. We're not really, that's not how people think. That's not how the military thinks. That's not how they should think. You've got to look at the hardware. You've got to look at the capacity of that hardware. You, in effect, disregard stated intentions. And this is one reason why arms control treaties are so important, because nobody really trusts some statement by some guy saying, oh, yeah, we're not going to cause you a problem. What you have to do is get verifiable treaties that restrain the deployment of weapons. And that's the one hard and fact thing that you can really go to the bank on. Anyway, as you said further, in 2021, a series of things happened, irrespective of these actions. First, NATO had another meeting, I believe it was in Brussels, that reaffirmed the 2008 statement that said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And then both the State Department and the Department of Defense, the US State Department and Department of Defense, in separate actions, signed independent bilateral treaties with Ukraine, not through NATO, that on the one hand affirmed the NATO statement that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, and on the other hand established expanded military development that were designed to bring Ukraine up to NATO military standards. At the same time, you've got these live fire exercises going on. You've got NATO reaffirming entry. You've got the US State Department and Department of Defense signing new and independent treaties with Ukraine that involve militarily arming. You have the deployment of these already deployed weapons in Romania and the slated deployment of these offensive capable launch systems in Poland. Russia really just said, this is completely unacceptable. You're right on our border. You're making massive threats to us. And at that point, they started massing troops on their border. Interestingly, and this was reported in The Intercept in March, early March, that based on reports from U.S. intelligence services, I'm trying to remember if it was U.S. intelligence services or conversations with U.S. military senior officers, that Putin had not even decided to invade until February 2022. This was not something where they were massing troops and planning a long-term invasion. What this seems to me the most plausible explanation is that they were trying to signal to the United States that they were extremely serious, that they took the threat to their security from all these steps very serious, and they needed to negotiate a decision that Ukraine would not join NATO, that NATO forces would back away from Russia's border. And then there may have been questions about some kind of partial autonomy for the Donbass territories. So it's kind of an extraordinary set of events, and the evidence points to the fact that Russia was not even planning to do an attack. But it was only when the U.S. completely and just said, forget it, we're not going to talk to you about NATO. And you can find statements by U.S. people in the State Department that basically say, yeah, NATO was off the table. That was not even something we were willing to discuss. So it was only when the U.S. really just said, forget it, we're not going to even discuss NATO with you, that at that point, I think Russia decided that they really have to go in. I'm not saying it was a wise decision. Anytime you're launching an attack that involves deaths of civilian population, I cannot approve of that. But if you look at this in terms of how countries react internationally and how the U.S. would react in an equivalent situation with a shoe on the other foot, you can certainly understand why they did what they did.
Definitely provide some context. So we're 9 months into this conflict now. We've seen a serious escalation in October. You mentioned Nord Stream 1 and 2 having giant holes blown into them. A major bridge that connects Russia to Crimea seriously damaged by an explosion, not taken down altogether, but damaged to the point that Russia decided to respond with a number of attacks throughout the country of Ukraine that has literally knocked 30% of power out to that country right now. What do you think the immediate future holds for this conflict, Ben?
Yeah, boy, it's very disturbing. And I don't have a clear formulation of what the immediate future holds. I mean, there's certainly been a large escalation that's occurred. I mean, this destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, which itself maybe we want to talk about, but the attack on the Crimean Bridge. And I think also you have to take into account, I mean, Russia has been looking for negotiations from the start of the war. They view diplomacy and militarism as being tightly integrated, a kind of Clausewitzian idea that diplomacy and war is diplomacy by other means, and diplomacy is war by other means. So I think that Russia really from the beginning was looking to negotiate a peace treaty. And in fact, in March, Ukraine and Russia were negotiating. There was a 15-point program on the table, and it looked like they were going to go ahead and actually have a settlement. And at that point, Boris Johnson showed up in Ukraine and basically told Zelensky, you may be ready for peace, but we're not ready. This was actually reported in the Ukrainian publication, Ukrainska Pravda, and then it was subsequently, the main outlines were validated by a report in the journal Foreign Affairs. So this is for real, that there really likely would have been a peace treaty in March, but it was sabotaged by Boris Johnson, who was then Prime Minister of the UK. And in fact, it's very likely that Johnson would not have taken such a step without the US approval. And it's quite possible it was actually a US plan that was being carried out by Johnson. So I think on top of the fact that you have this ongoing war, that you've had some successes by the Ukrainian military, The fact that the U.S. has refused to have negotiations of any sort with Russia to move towards peace, and then the attack on the bridge, and perhaps the pipeline attack was played into this, which again, many people are assuming that was done by Russia, which I think is a very bad and wrong assumption, but let's even leave that out of the picture. I think Russia basically just decided, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back. It's been widely acknowledged. The Western media does not like to say it. They like to talk about war crimes. They like to talk about, crazy attacks on civilian populations. This was actually quite a carefully controlled military operation. If you look at the numbers of forces, the force deployments, if you look at numbers of civilian casualties compared to military casualties, there are a lot of variables that suggest this was extremely limited. And it was only when all these things came together, and I think Putin started to feel under pressure from people within his own government, that we are fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, that now at that point, they decided to undertake more significant attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, especially electricity. And it seems the primary reason they wanted to disrupt electrically driven transport of arms and troops that were occurring within Ukraine, especially the transport of troops from the western border of Ukraine, where they were being staged in Poland and other places and moved towards the fronts. And by attacking the electrical grid, that is one way to disrupt the train service and other forms of troop and supply transport within Ukraine. So even here, although there have been some civilian deaths, if you actually look at the numbers, they appear to be quite limited. These were not unconstrained attacks on civilian populations in Russia. These were targeted attacks on infrastructure, especially electrical infrastructure, that seems to have been done primarily to disrupt military operations. Again, I'm not in favor of what happened here in this war. It's all very bad and very ugly, but it's driven both before the war started and during the war. It's driven largely by the West and largely by the U.S. At any point, the U.S. could have sued for peace, but they wanted to keep supporting Zelensky. People also talk about Zelensky and Ukrainian agency and a humanitarian war. There's no agency here. The U.S. disrupted whatever agency there was when they were involved with Boris Johnson, or let's just say the West generically, and disrupted that peace treaty. It also, as far as the humanitarian war, it's craziness. I mean, you have, tens and possibly hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying and being maimed due to the ongoing nature of this war because the U.S. does not want to have a peace treaty. There's very little agency here, and there's very little humanitarian. The U.S., a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, Chaz Freeman, has described the situation as fighting to the last Ukrainian for Ukrainian independence. This really is a proxy war right on Russia's border, being fought on battlefield Ukraine with, frankly, a lot of Ukrainians serving as cannon fodder for U.S. and NATO purposes.
Why is it ridiculous to believe that Russia is responsible for the Nord Stream attacks?
I don't want to go quite so far as to say it's ridiculous.
Okay.
I think it's unknown who actually carried this out, but I think there's pretty strong reason to think that this was done either by the U.S. or by Western forces, likely in collaboration with the U.S. To start with, just to frame it, sorry, I'm talking blue streak here. I gotta catch my breath for a second. Let me grab a sip here for 1 second.
Sure.
First, for many years, the U.S. has been opposed to the Nord Stream pipelines. The U.S. is very concerned that countries in Europe, and especially Germany, might establish closer relationships with Russia. That they are afraid that somehow, the way it's sometimes described, is that Russia might peel Germany off from the transatlantic alliance and establish a closer relationship with them. The U.S. has been very opposed to this, has worked very hard to, in various ways, prevent the Nord Stream pipelines from operating, from going into operation. There have been threats of sanctions of all sorts to prevent these from going on. So that's the background. The US for a long time has not wanted these pipelines. Then if you move forward to this year, when Russia was massing troops on the Ukrainian border, early February, weeks before the invasion, both President Biden and this same Victoria Nuland I mentioned before, who was so involved in the overturning of the legitimately elected Ukrainian government in 2014, she has been now, I mean, she stays in government, gives you a sense of the nature of how these policies have continued. She was elevated from Assistant Secretary of Defense to Undersecretary of Defense for Political Affairs. This is a number four position in the State Department. Any case, Victoria Nuland and even more so Joe Biden in early February stated that if Russia invades, that one way or another, the Nord Stream pipelines will be taken out. They used the term, Victoria Nuland said one way or another, they will not operate. And Joe Biden actually spoke about ending the pipelines. You can find the videos of this online. I can provide you the links to that if you want to pass it on to your readers. Any case, so the very fact that these people, senior people, the president and the Undersecretary of Defense for Political Affairs, stated that if Russia invades, this is going to happen. And then Russia invades, and then this happens. That got to make you suspicious. On top of that, there are other things that were going on. The US and NATO, actually, this is just US, not NATO, carries out every year a set of naval military operations in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is the sea that these pipelines pass under. They go from Russia under the Baltic, kind of passing by Sweden and Denmark, and then land in Germany. And that's where the natural gas gets passed through. Every year, the US basically controls the Baltic Sea. They have a set of naval operations called BALTOPS, basically Baltic operations. This is a set of naval operations that's run by the US Naval Sixth Fleet, which operates out of Italy. It's a massive military training exercises. This year, one of the major operations that they carried out had to do with anti-mine operations. This is where you use unmanned undersea vehicles, UUVs, to go down and place demolitions on mines that have been placed underwater, and you explode them. These are exactly the same kind of technology that one would use if one wants to blow up a pipeline. Now, this, it so happens that these drills this year took place near an island that is exactly where the pipelines passed by and where the explosions took place. And it also turned out that one of the major ships that was involved in this operations, this is the Kearsarge. It's an amphibious landing ship, with helicopters and all kinds of other stuff, actually stayed in the area for almost a month after the operations ended. And just a few days before the explosions of the pipelines, the Kearsarge left the area. And it's possible that the Kearsarge was involved in providing deep sea intelligence of that exact area, and that there were undersea demolitions. It's also possible that Poland, that Sweden, that possibly even Denmark were involved. And the fact that the Polish, that Radek Sikorski, who again was not only currently a European Parliament member, but was basically the Polish foreign minister, said thank you US, suggests that the US was involved in one way or another.
Yeah, I've seen it suggested that they were thanking the US for giving a heads up, like that something like this could happen. And I guess that begs the question, Ben, because you did not want to go as far as saying it's ridiculous to think that Russia was responsible for the Nord Stream attacks. What is the valid explanation if it was Russia? Because that's one that I can't wrap my head around.
Yeah. It's funny. I have to say, I haven't yet figured out exactly how I want to talk about this.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, I really do believe it was the US. I think the evidence points to either the US or US support for the operation.
Mhm.
That's my take of it. But my take doesn't mean that there's 100% hard and fast evidence.
Right.
That's me personally, Ben Abelow, what I think happened, or what I think probably happened. I don't think Russia had much motivation to do this. First of all, this is their own infrastructure. This is a multi-billion-dollar project. What do they have to gain by blowing up their pipeline? Further, to the extent that it was blown up, if it was just shut down, they maintain leverage. They can say, you in Germany, you're having a freezing cold winter. We can restart the pipeline. We can give you gas. But if you blow the pipelines up, you can't restart them. Now, as it turned out, one of the 4 lines remained operative. Each of these, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, is a duplex. It has two pipes within it. So both of the Nord Stream 1s were exploded, and one of the Nord Stream 2s were blown up. My guess is that whoever did this wanted to get all 4, but a couple hundred feet under the sea surface, you can make mistakes. Things sometimes just don't operate correctly. But I don't really see much motivation for Russia. The only conceivable thing, and I haven't actually verbalized this before, and I haven't run it by knowledgeable people to see whether this even makes sense, is if Russia felt that somehow there was going to be a complete loss, that they could actually cause a total financial collapse in Germany by never restarting the pipelines, and they wanted to have plausible deniability, so they could say, we didn't just not start the pipelines and cause Germany to collapse, but they wanted to set it up so that they could not restart the pipelines. You could make a potential argument that they blew it up for that reason. I don't think that makes sense because, as I said, number one, this is extremely valuable material from them. I think their primary motivation would be to try to use leverage on Germany and to maintain a stable relationship by offering to reestablish the gas line. But, to some extent, I just played devil's advocate and said, if I wanted to really think this through and try to speculate on how it conceivably could even make sense, that's what I would say right now. And again, I may talk to somebody who knows more about this than I do, who says, no, that doesn't make sense for this reason. But, I wanted to just be forthright about that.
In the meantime, I'm going to replace ridiculous with far-fetched.
Far-fetched. I like that. Yeah. I like that. I would go with that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Last question, Ben. For somebody who obviously studies this region as closely as you do and has kept a close eye on the war as well, how concerned are you that Russia uses a nuclear weapon on Ukraine? And if that were to happen, what would it look like in terms of the tactical details and I guess just the overall destruction as well? Because that's obviously something that a lot of people are really concerned about right now.
Yeah, I think it's right to be concerned that this whole thing could go nuclear. I think that Russia would not contemplate using a nuclear weapon unless they felt that their vital interests were at risk, which might take the form of they were concerned that they were vulnerable to a land invasion of Russia, that they were concerned that there might be some kind of Western run military coup trying to overthrow Putin. The question that's of most concern to me right now is that now that Russia has claimed sovereignty over these 4 areas, the 2 Donbass areas and then the other 2, the concern is that if they truly consider that part of Russian territory now, and the US and Ukraine and NATO are hell-bent on reacquiring those territories, I have a question in my mind. Is it possible that Russia might actually use nuclear weapons to defend those territories? Now, the reality is that Russia is in a much better position militarily than NATO is. I mean, it's really right there. And up till now, they really have been fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and they just called up 300,000 reserves. So I don't think they're going to be in a position where their conventional forces are going to be unable to defeat attacks on these areas. So I think we're not talking about something that's imminent here. And Russia, I don't think, is crazy either. They realize that there's a potential for escalation. so that even if they have some short-term advantage to using a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon to, protect one of their new annexed territories, they know that this could go nuclear and cause a global thermonuclear war that would wipe out Russia. So nobody wants to use these weapons lightly. But I think the risk is higher than it had been. And it's high enough that we should be damn concerned. I also have to say that although the U.S. claims it would never use they would not use a nuclear weapon in this situation, I have some concerns. If it in fact is the case that the U.S. and NATO, by virtue of geography, is in a much less able position to fight a true war in Ukraine, and they started to lose, would they consider a tactical weapon? I mean, it seems that both sides, and this is what's so troubling and why I think a peace treaty, starting with, peace treaty maybe makes it sound too big. Let's start with a ceasefire. Let's start with cessation of hostilities. Let's start with something that stops the fighting. And then we try to take it to the next level. This is one reason why this is so essential, because you have two places that view their vital interests. Actually, that's not correct. Russia views its vital interests as being on the line. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, this is a vital interest to the US. But nonetheless, the US has its ego at stake. You can imagine how it would feel, its reputation would suffer if after all this, it lost or it pulled out. So I think the US is really afraid of having egg on its face. And, these people might be willing to launch a nuclear war because they don't want to have egg on their face. And Russia certainly would consider using a nuke if they really felt that their survival was at stake. So this is extremely dangerous. How big are these weapons? I don't know the exact smallest number of, how these go. Some of them are selectable yields. Like I mentioned, the Tomahawks, you can dial up how high you want these things to go. These battlefield weapons, some of them are selectable or not. Some of them are just small. But they can be anything from, I think, I'm going to go out on a limb here. Don't quote me on this. Let's say 1/10 of a kiloton, which is equivalent to 100 tons of TNT, probably up to 10 or 15 kilotons, which is probably like a Hiroshima-sized bomb. And there's a full range. I'm guessing that the typical ones are, again, don't quote me, I'm kind of going by some old knowledge here, 1 to 5 kilotons. Anywhere between 1/10 and 1/10 and let's say 1/3 or 1/2 the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So you're talking about something pretty significant. And the real problem, of course, is as bad as this would be by itself, if there was an exchange of tactical nukes, where does this stop? Do you really think that Russia would use this and the US would kind of just allow its forces to be wiped out without doing something? Maybe saner heads would prevail. And at that point, the US would do what, frankly, would be the smart thing to do, is say, you just nuked our tank division. This could really get bad. Let's sit down at a table. I would like to think that one side would do that. I don't have a great level of trust that that would happen. I think what we've seen in this war at almost every stage is increasing escalation. I mean, you see it even in terms of this bridge bombing. What happens with the bridge bombing? Well, the bombing of the bridge is one of the factors that led Russia to go ahead and finally decide to attack Ukrainian infrastructure in a serious way. Then Ukrainian hears about that, and they say, well, damned if we're going to sit still for that attack. And the US says the same thing. Now they're interested in pouring more weapons in. So at every stage, both sides have this kind of absurd fantasy that if they attack the other side will back down and do what in some sense might be the rational thing. But the reality is what the other side always does is up the ante and say, we're not going to be had. If we cave in now, what's going to happen next week? We're going to be giving in to the we're caving in. So I think it's very concerning that there could be a possible use of nuclear weapons and that this could escalate. And there's really no natural stopping point for an escalation. If it goes all the way up the ladder, you're talking about really the end of human civilization. I mean, literally. And it could be the end of human life if you have a global, nuclear winter sets in. That could just kill everybody. So we're really talking about the death of the planet from a human perspective. And the idea that people are so cavalier about this war continuing, and we're going to fight the evil Russians, and we're going to even leaving aside the fact that this war is not Ukrainian agency and it's not a humanitarian war. It's as I said, it's a proxy war on battlefield Ukraine, fought with Ukrainian cannon fodder. But even if you made all these generous assumptions about what this war was from the Western perspective, this thing has got to stop. There's way too much risk involved for this to be going on.
Where can people find you online, Ben?
Yeah, good question. I mean, right now, the only online presence I really have is my book at Amazon. I have a website which is almost built. It's a website for the book, which is almost built. I don't do Facebook or Twitter or any of those things. I just don't have time.
Well, I'm jealous. I'm jealous of that.
Oh yeah, whatever. So I would say now, if you're interested, the best thing to do is get my book. I would say you can get it by ebook also. It's just $2.99. I can actually give an email address that people can reach me directly if they want to.
Sure.
That is my first name is Benjamin, so it's B.Abelow, ABELOW .2022 @gmail.com. b.abelow.2022 @gmail.com. Check out my book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. It's kind of been a #1 bestseller in a number of Amazon categories. It's a good little book. It's not too expensive.
And it's not too long either. You're right about that. I want to say it comes out to around 60 or 70 pages, and you really don't waste a whole lot of words. He is Benjamin Abelow. The new book is How the West Brought War to Ukraine, Understanding How U.S. and NATO Policies Led to Crisis, War, and the Risk of Nuclear Catastrophe. Ben, thank you so much for the time today, and thank you for this important book that provides a really nice level of nuance to one of the more serious things happening in the world right now.
Thanks, Trey. It's been a pleasure being here.
Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. And thanks to you for hanging out. You can watch, listen, learn, and connect for free at booksonpod.com. For Books on Pod, I'm Trey Elling. Good day.